Welcome to Worth Your Time with your hosts from the nationally syndicated Bob and Tom Show, Kristi Lee, and the president and CEO of the Indianapolis Zoo, Dr. Rob Shumaker. Our mission to inform, entertain, and educate with guests from all aspects of life. We guarantee there isn't another podcast that features two hosts with such different backgrounds and discussions with remarkable people doing exceptional things. So let's get started. Here are your hosts, Kristi Lee and Dr. Rob Shumaker.
We are excited to bring to you the second part of our interview with Dr. Steve Amstrup, who is the expert on polar bears. If you've missed our first episode and you're just joining us, you need to go back and listen because we are really into polar bears right now.
Start from the beginning.
Yes, you don't want to miss any of it.
Don't miss a word of it.
It's so exciting. He's definitely worth your time, and we are having an amazing conversation, and we're going to pick things up. Dr. Rob, of course, is here with me right now, and we're going to pick things up with polar bear hibernation. That's where we left off in the last episode, and you had an interesting story about, because I had asked, as a layperson, not a scientist like the two of you, do polar bears hibernate? Do all bears hibernate? I don't know that, and I know that polar bears have to spend so much time searching for food because it's hard to find. I didn't know if there was a hibernation period or not.
Yeah, so we could start by the basics of polar bears and the other bears, for that matter. There's a big debate about should we call what they do in their period of winter dormancy in a den, should we call that hibernation, or is it something else? And I think that most people now believe that it should be called hibernation, but the debate sort of orients around comparing what bears do in a den to what the ground squirrels and other small mammals that hibernate do. And if you think of a ground squirrel, you'll see them in the spring and early summer, and then they disappear and they go into the ground, and it's called estivating, but it's really a period of hibernation. And then they do the same thing in the winter. And during the period when those animals are not feeding and are what we call hibernating, their body temperature lowers down to near ambient temperature. And during that period, they will periodically arouse. They'll awaken and they'll get up and they'll feed a little bit. They'll drink or eat some moist vegetation that they've stored in their lair. And then they will urinate, defecate, and then go back to sleep. They punctuate that period of hibernation from a very deep dormant. Well, you can take a ground squirrel that's hibernating and pick it up in your hands, and it's like holding a stick. They just, they seem like they're probably dead and they're stiff. But if you hold them long enough, the warmth of your hands will cause them to wake up. And then if you're not quick enough to put them down, they might bite you. But that's very different than what the bears do. The bears, one of the big differences is body temperature. Polar bears and other bears that are in their dens don't lower their body temperature that much. They'll lower it maybe 5 degrees Celsius or something like that. So they are cooler than they are in the case of the active bear out running around. But they're a lot warmer than, say, a ground squirrel. And so a lot of people have said, well, that's not really hibernation. But there have been some studies that suggest that part of the reason that their body temperature doesn't get so low is simply because of the mass of their bodies. They're a much bigger animal, and so lowering that body mass down to near freezing would be an insurmountable feat. So that, I think, is sort of a bogus argument, the body temperature thing. And something else that the bears do that is, I think, a more advanced than what the smaller mammals do that hibernate is that they go into the den. They don't eat or drink or periodically arouse themselves to urinate and defecate. They are totally out until they come out in the spring, or in the case of a female bear in a den with cubs, she has to be alert to nurse those cubs. That's a slightly different topic, which I think we'll probably get into in a moment. But the answer, do bears hibernate? I think there are some physiologists out there who may still be debating what do we call it. But I say that bears do hibernate. And
how long were you talking about, Steve, when from the time they enter their den till they come out? What's the period of time they're in there?
So in northern Alaska, where I did most of my research, they would enter their dens in late October, early November, typically. And then they would emerge in, say, middle of March, something like
incredible.
that. Yeah. So it's a really long period of time. And it's during that period that the females are nursing their cubs that were born about the first of the year. So they enter the den in time to be prepared for their cubs to be born. Now, there's something that I think is a really important and interesting difference between polar bears and the other bears, and that is that if you think about a black bear or a grizzly bear feeding on land and they're eating vegetation and they're catching fish and small mammals and whatever else is available, the main reason that they go into a den in the wintertime is because most of the things that they eat are just unavailable in the winter. And so for them, the period of denning, whether you call it hibernation or not, the period of denning is a foraging strategy. Why spend a lot of effort running around trying to find food if there isn't any for you to find? Instead, conserve energy, lower your body temperature a little bit, lower your activity, and just conserve that energy through the winter and then come back out of the den when food is again available. Now,
plus, he doesn't like a good nap.
Yeah, 6 months, 5, 6, why not?
That's right, yeah.
So, Steve, when you were surveying bears in the wild, polar bears, sometimes you would find them in the dens and try and collect samples in the dens. All right, is that correct?
But let me finish that point, Rob, about the difference. So polar bears differ from the other bears in that their food is theoretically available all winter long.
Wow.
Male polar bears and bears that are not pregnant, polar bears that are not pregnant, typically don't go into dens in the wintertime. Now, if there's a really severe storm, they might temporarily make a den for a few days or even up to a week or two if it's a really bad storm, but then they come out and they continue to forage. Females need to go into the den because they're going to give birth around the first of the year at the coldest time of the year, and their cubs need that protection to be in that den for the first couple of months of their life. So in the case of polar bears, the period of winter denning is really a reproductive strategy rather than a foraging strategy.
Right.
And another wrinkle that maybe you're interested in hearing about this is that bears are what we call induced ovulators. So they breed in the spring of the year, and it's the act of breeding that causes the female to release her eggs. And so that's probably an adaptation because of the fact that they live at very low densities. So a female doesn't want to be ovulating willy-nilly when there's no males around. Yeah. So this times ovulation with the act of breeding. But that happens in the spring, and the bears don't give birth until the first of the year. So it's a 7-month gestation period. But literally most of that is in a period of stasis, where after breeding, the conceptus, the product of fertilization, develops only to what we call a blastocyst stage. It's a matter of a few hundred cells. And that conceptus stopped in its migration in the fallopian tube of the female. It doesn't even make it all the way to the uterus until the autumn, when about the time they're going into the den, then the conceptus migrates into the uterus and active development ensues. So there's maybe a 2-month period of active development and 5 months of relative stasis.
It's incredible.
I had no idea.
Yeah. So that's an interesting strategy that all of the bears do that. But in the case of polar bears, it's perhaps even more remarkable.
So what is an average 1 to 2 cubs then?
So in Alaska, the average litter size was 1.6.
Okay.
And I never did see a 0.6 of a cub. But if you average, we saw a few litters of 3. They were quite rare. And we saw lots of litters of 1, but mostly litters of 2.
Now at birth, they're relatively tiny compared to the mom.
Yeah, that's a really good point that continues on the business about when they go into the den and that sort of thing. Polar bears and other members of the bear family, they produce their young at a very altricial or undeveloped state. So a 600-pound female polar bear might give birth to a cub that weighs 1.5 pounds or 2 pounds.
It's incredible.
Oh.
They're like guinea pig size, and they're blind. They're essentially hairless. They're totally helpless. At that point, the female has very little reproductive investment in the cub. The mother's investment really comes after she gives birth, and she produces this incredibly rich milk that's over 40% fat. And then the cubs really grow fast. So what we think of as a baby bear is actually 2.5 or 3 months old, because that's when they come out of the dens. And the really cute little animals that we'd all like to hold, although I don't recommend that at home. But that's not really the infant bear. It's like a toddler bear.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are familiar with panda cubs because I've seen a lot of those little teeny hairless little panda cubs.
Like a stick of butter size.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we don't get to see a polar bear cub that often, obviously, for a lot of reasons. Yeah. Have you been in a den?
We did a research project in the late 90s, early 2000s, trying to characterize what polar bear dens looked like, and particularly how big the structures are and how much snow is over the top. The justification for that was that I was trying to test whether we could actually detect polar bear dens under the snow with a forward-looking infrared viewing device. And the idea was that if we could identify where dens are, we could protect them from subsequent human activities, which in my case, studying in northern Alaska, was oil and gas activities. People trundling around over the snow and ice with these big vehicles or building ice roads. How could we protect those things? And I thought, we know where the habitat is, but we don't really know the particular locations where female bears will den in any one year. So we were doing a test of that, and part of that test was we knew that some of the dens that we had identified from radio-collared bears, we knew right where they were, and we knew we could see some of them or detect some of them with the infrared device, but others we couldn't. So why was it that some were visible and some were not? And is there a way to refine our viewing so that we could detect more of them? And so that required us to crawl into a lot of dens. Now, to Rob's point a moment ago, we wanted to go into the dens after the bears had left.
That's a good idea.
That's really important. And so we would wait. Most of the dens that we were monitoring were dens of female bears that were radio collared. So we knew when they left the den. But there were a few that we had just discovered by visual observation in the wintertime or in the fall before they went into the den, and we could see where they were digging. And we knew, okay, there's going to be a den there. And there was one of these that was of particular interest because it was in an area that we had seen her, but we knew that she wasn't collared, so we couldn't get in there until we had visual verification that she left. And we'd been watching her periodically through the spring, and she'd been in and out of the den with her cubs. We knew she had 2 cubs, and we were thinking any day she's going to leave. And then we had this big blow come through, a big blizzard, 3 days of really high winds. And when we could get back out on the ice, we went out to the little island where her den was, and we couldn't see it. We knew where it was approximately, but we couldn't see it. And so we thought, we'll just wait. And we waited for about a week, and we didn't see any evidence of her coming back out with her cubs. We thought she must have left right before the storm, or maybe even during the storm, and she's no longer there. So we'll go ahead and go in and probe around and find that den and do our measurements. So we were doing that, and we were all pretty confident that the bear wasn't there anymore. We had these probe sticks like you use for searching for people in avalanches, and we had shovels, and we were digging around and hadn't really found anything yet. And I had been exploring one spot where I thought it was, and I took about 2 steps to my right, and ploosh, my right leg just went right down through the roof of the den. And so there I was dangling. My right leg was just limp, hanging down, dangling. My left leg is collapsed underneath me in a position where I couldn't really stand up because it happened so suddenly. It just was an awkward position for me. And I hollered at my partner, Jeff York. I said, Jeff, I think I found it. And he started laughing. He said, yeah, it looks like you did. And about that time, I heard this and it was windy that day. And I thought that was just a gust of wind. And then I heard, and I looked down, and the mother bear's head was about 6 inches from my thigh.
Oh.
And it seemed like it was a long time, but I'm sure it was only a matter of seconds. But I looked at her and she looked at me, and for whatever reason, she almost had more of a curiosity look about her than an aggressive look. And she was looking up at me, and I looked down at her, and then I just threw my upper body over my shoulder as hard as I could. It was a very steep slope, so as soon as I popped out of the den, I was rolling down the hill. She bust out of the den after me, but she only followed me for a few feet. And then she saw Jeff up above her on the hill, and so she turned and started to go for Jeff, and he fell down, and now he's rolling down the hill. And so apparently she decided that that neither one of us doofuses rolling down the hill was a threat. And so we were all fine. And then the helicopter pilot got the helicopter engine going, and she started to run down the beach. We went and we captured her. We put her in a net, and we brought her back to her den. We went in, we made our measurements. We found the cubs. We weighed and measured and marked the cubs. And everything was great. We left them right by the den, and now we have a radio collar on her, so we knew that a couple of days later she left the den and went out on the ice. And as Paul Harvey used to say, there is a rest of the story. And that was in 2001 when I caught that female and her cubs. The cubs were about 25 pounds apiece. And in the year 2020, another colleague of mine, still working in Alaska, capturing bears, captured one of those cubs. Oh. And it was a male, and that bear weighed 1,025 pounds when he captures. We saw him at two extremes of its life, and that was quite an interesting end of that story.
It is remarkable.
Hey, Steve, you mentioned earlier, to me, a fascinating thought that polar bears don't really mark territory because their territory moves. So could you help people understand the relationship between polar bears and sea ice and what you mean by their territory moving?
Sure. Yeah, we need to understand that we hear all the time, polar bears depend on the sea ice. And if the sea ice melts, it's not going to be good for polar bears. And it isn't already in some places. But a lot of people don't understand why the ice is important. And the ice is important because polar bears can only catch their seal prey. They feed mainly on two species of seals, the ringed seal and the bearded seal, and they can only catch those prey from the surface of the ice. Polar bears can swim really well, but they can't swim as well as a seal. And so they can't catch them in open water, and these seals very rarely haul out on land, so they can't wait on the beach for them to haul out. And so polar bears depend on the sea ice, not just as a platform to walk around on, but as the interface between them and their prey. So when the ice is gone, the seals can still swim around and live a pelagic lifestyle until the ice comes back in the fall. Polar bears are just without food when the ice is away and they can't catch seals.
Can you explain I was going to say, can you explain how that has changed over the years since you've been going to Alaska?
Yeah, it marks a real change in the arc of my career, I guess I would say. So to answer that question, Kristi, the sea ice has been pulling away from the shore for longer periods for the last several decades. And in fact, in the polar basin, we have seen about a 12 to 14% per decade decline in the summertime extent, the September extent of the sea ice. That's when the ice is at its minimum extent. And so that has caused a dramatic impact on polar bears over much of their range already. But to give you an example of what that means, you can see a curve of, there's a declining curve for sure of time and sea ice extent. But the example that sticks in my mind is the first several years that I worked in Alaska. In the summertime, in September, I could go to the North Slope in Prudhoe Bay or Point Barrow, Kaktovik. I could look offshore and the sea ice was right there. If it wasn't right against the shore, it was only a few miles offshore. Now it's hundreds of miles offshore. It's beyond the curvature of the earth, so you can't see the ice in the late summer. You can't see the ice from land at all. And that's, if you had told me in 1980, when I first went up there, that I was going to see that kind of a change in the environment, I'd have told you were crazy. That couldn't happen. But in fact, it has. And an important part of that sea ice retreat from the shore is that over most of the Arctic basin, the productive part of the ocean is right near the shore, that shallow water over the continental shelf. And that's where polar bears prefer to be. My early radiotelemetry work showed that in September, when the ice was there in those early years, that's where the bears were. The radio-collared bears were all out there in that shallow water, fairly close to shore. Now, there's no ice there at all. So clearly, you don't even have to do any analysis to realize that that can't be good for polar bears.
No.
So your work was directly responsible for having polar bears listed as part of the Endangered Species Act, or listed on as an endangered species. Can you explain the sequence of events that led you to be in that position, to have to spread that news and spread the word that created that situation?
Yeah, I've had a really interesting arc in my career with polar bears. When I first went to Alaska, my first publications were documenting an increasing population in northern Alaska that was a result of the cessation of the excessive harvest that had been occurring in the 1950s and 1960s. In those years, polar bear trophy hunting had become a really big deal, and it was being done by people flying out with a pair of Super Cub aircraft over the ice, spotting a bear, and then they would land a hunter down on the ice, and then the other airplane would haze the bear towards the hunter so that he could get a shot. Not very sporting, very efficient, and many bears were killed, and that resulted in a declining population. But I documented that declining trend had reversed, and we had a thriving, robust, and growing population by the early 80s. Now, contrast that with the work that I was doing, documenting all aspects of polar bear ecology, and realizing by the early 2000s, even the late 90s, that things were changing. And we noticed it in our in our inability to get out on the ice in the fall like we used to do to go catch bears. We couldn't do it anymore after 2000. And also, we were starting to see the impacts of that declining ice that I was just describing. We were starting to see that by the early to mid 2000s. We were starting to see that in terms of the numbers of bears we encountered, in terms of the numbers of young bears that we were seeing, in terms of the size of the adult bears that we were seeing, just smaller bears in general and fewer of them. And this evidence was being picked up. We were reporting it as we went along, different impacts that we were seeing, and it was picked up by environmental organizations that then brought suit or petitioned the Department of Interior to list polar bears because of the threat of global warming. And that resulted in 2007, the Secretary of Interior, Dirk Kempthorne, under the George W. Bush administration, asked my lab to inform him how he should respond to that petition. And that resulted in a huge effort during the summer of 2007. We actually brought other scientists on board from different parts of the world, different agencies, universities, and we produced a series of reports that convinced Secretary Kempthorne that polar bears had to be listed. And in fact, he called the whole team that had done that work when he made his decision in early 2000 and said, the administration really didn't want to do this, but you have given me no choice. It's clear that polar bears are threatened by the declining sea ice caused by global warming. And so in 2000, I think it was in May of 2008, polar bears became the first species listed under the Endangered Species Act because of the threat of climate change.
And because of your work, Dr. Steve Amstrup. Thank you so much. What is their status now?
They're still threatened. And in some places, there's one thing that we can say that is going for us or working for us in the polar bear world. with regard to the threat of global warming. And that is that we still do have globally a large number of bears. A global population is probably something like 20 to 25,000. So if you compare them to, say, mountain gorillas or many other species that are on the endangered species list, they're quite abundant. But one of the things that's very clear is if we allow greenhouse gas emissions to continue, if we allow the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to continue to rise as we have, ultimately all polar bears will disappear. So the trajectory is clear. We just maybe have a little bit more time. But I want to be very clear that we have commonly said, I and others have said, we have time to save polar bears. We have time to take the action. And we really need to change that because we've been saying we have time since the 80s, and we haven't done anything. We haven't changed our trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions. And so what I say now is we can act in time to save polar bears. But I don't want to give people that sort of false sense of, oh yeah, we have time, because we've been taking advantage of that to procrastinate.
And so what can we do?
The most important thing that we can all do is to vote for policy leaders that actually take our future seriously. We have government leaders at all levels who claim that they're concerned about our children, that they're concerned about our future. But yet, this is the most existential threat that we've ever faced in terms of not just polar bears, but all of us, because we're all connected. And yet, we've just seen a lot of hemming and hawing and hiding our heads in the sand. So voting is really important. Let's get the public representatives in there who really take our future seriously. But also, there are important things that the private sector can do. And one of those that we can help with is supporting businesses that take sustainability seriously. There are some businesses that are really out there and saying, look, we recognize that global warming is a problem. We recognize that plastics are a problem, and they're trying to do things about it. And we need to support those organizations as well. And in fact, recently I've been thinking, what we really need is for the private sector to start lobbying. Some of these businesses that have good sustainability plans should be lobbying our policymakers to get on the stick to do something. And if the policymakers don't volunteer to do it, maybe the private sector can drag them along, kicking and screaming. We talked about the Endangered Species Act and the fact that polar bears were listed as a threatened species under the ESA because of the threat of climate change, which is caused by our emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And in 2010, I published a paper that sort of summarized the work that had convinced the Secretary of Interior that he needed to list polar bears. But there was a little bit of a hiccup in that the Department of Interior, after the listing, looked at available data, and I think there were some political motivations for following this course, but nonetheless, they came up with a memo. The solicitor of the department drafted a memo that has been fondly referred to as the Bernhardt Memo that said, even though polar bears were listed because of the threat of global warming, we can't consider emissions. We can't consider human emissions when we're doing endangered species evaluations of proposed actions, unless we can tie those emissions directly to an impact on the bears. We didn't at that time have the ability to say X number of gigatons of CO2 would have this impact on polar bears. And that's in 2010, we published this paper describing what we thought the threats would be. And we're still on track with those predictions that I made in 2010. But we didn't really have the mechanistic underpinnings of that. And those mechanistic underpinnings is what the Bernhardt Memo was really pointing at. Now we have them. And last year, I published a paper along with Cecilia Bitz, a sea ice scientist from the University of Washington. We published a paper documenting the attribution or showing direct attribution of emissions to polar bear survival. And so now we hear people talk about how much of the severity of this storm can be attributed to global warming, or how much of the fire season can be attributed to global warming. What we've done is we've directly attributed reproductive failure or recruitment failure to our emissions. We have graphs that link for each of the 19 separate subpopulations how much changes in our emissions impact their reproduction and survival. So now we have overcome that hurdle, and hopefully going forward, we will be able to consider our human emissions and the emissions that would be caused by a particular action. So suppose there's a proposal to develop a bunch of oil wells in the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf of California or places like that. Now we can say, if we did that, here's the impact that it would have on polar bears in all of these different parts of their range. And importantly, the method that we used where we looked at emissions and basically by regression and simple regression analysis identified what the impact would be on polar bears, that same thing can be done for beach nesting birds, most of the penguin species, or beach nesting marine turtles, or bleaching events of corals, or the frequency and severity of wildfires. We can now look at those things directly related to emissions. And our paper came out in the journal Science in September 1st of last year. And I'm hopeful that that's going to be a way that we can go forward in a more sort of determined way to address the concept of emissions within the Endangered Species Act.
There's a couple things that always come to my mind about you, Steve. And one of the things that I find so unique is that unlike many scientists and many conservationists, you are so clearly identified with polar bears. You are the source. You are the people that everybody brings up when they want to talk about polar bears, and you are absolutely heroic in everything you've done. You're an incredible conservationist, fantastic scientist. I don't think you certainly don't say that about yourself, but thanks for letting us say it, because you're really, truly incredible and truly remarkable. But there's another piece that I really admire about what you do is that you're very clear, you're very thoughtful, you argue from the facts, but you always leave people with a sense of hope and with optimism. So I think you have a real talent for connecting the dots. So you take the facts, you take the reality, you take the current situation, but then you tie it to actions that are really important. So I'm so appreciative that you're a fantastic scientist who connects with so many people, gives them hope, gives them optimism. Thanks for everything that you do for polar bears and for conservation in general. You're just a tremendous guy.
Making our world a better place.
That's for sure.
You've been listening to Worth Your Time with Dr. Rob Shumaker and Kristi Lee. If you like what you hear, please give a review wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to tell your friends. Word of mouth is the best compliment. Thanks to our producers, Chris Spangle of Leaders and Legends, LLC. You can reach him at leadersandlegends.net. Also, thanks to Sophie Ritz. I'm Christopher Geisen. Thanks for joining us.